Hello everyone, hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm Steph from Simply Rhino, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first in a series of webinars focused on the use of V-Ray 2 for Rhino. Over the course of 6 webinars between today and the end of November, we aim to share many useful details on how this renderer applies itself to a broad range of industries and potential uses. There will be insights and information for those who are thinking about moving to a high-end rendering product, and plenty of useful tips for those already using V-Ray for Rhino. This first webinar will introduce V-Ray 2 for Rhino. We'll look at the user interface, how this can be simplified through the use of V-Ray Express. We'll also look at GI, Global Illumination, and how lighting in general is handled in V-Ray for Rhino. Both the real-time and production renderers will be demonstrated. We'll look at the material system and then introduce some of the more specific features which we'll explore in greater detail in later webinars. The webinar should last approximately 30 minutes, and our presenter is Phil Cook. Phil is an experienced product design professional and senior trainer here at Simply Rhino. He is responsible for our advanced and bespoke training. We do of course supply this software, Rhino, V-Ray for Rhino, and all other key plugins for Rhino. We are one of the leading suppliers of these tools in the world. This success is mainly due to our depth of product knowledge. You'll find that we only sell products we can support to an expert level. This is the focus that makes us different. We offer training too, both tailored project or company-specific workshops, and also public scheduled classes throughout the year. We will be happy to hear from any of you in the weeks, months, or years to come with any Rhino-related software or training requirements. The second webinar in this series is in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday the 27th of August. Details on what we intend to cover are on the webinar series page of the Simply Rhino website. Registration will open soon and you'll be all contacted with details about that. This webinar is being recorded so you can watch it again. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. We will update everyone as soon as it's available to view. As we progress through today's presentation, please do type any questions you may have and send to us. This is the method for asking your questions. You may have an answer directly within the chat, or it may be shared with the group later. There will be an official Q&A session following the software presentation where we'll cover many of the questions. Lastly, I'd like to say a quick thank you to Chaos Group, Scan Computers and PMY for their assistance. That's all for me for now, so let's hand over to Phil for the presentation. Phil, over to you.
Morning everybody, I'm Phil from Simply Rhino, and as Steph has said, in this webinar we're going to take a first look at V-Ray for Rhino, and we're going to take a look at how we can simplify Rhino using V-Ray Express, which is a free plugin from Chaos Group. So to start off with, I'd just like to explain a little bit about how light is calculated, not only in V-Ray but also in other rendering products as well. But there are some specific processes that we have that are exclusive to V-Ray. Before we do that, this is just a close-up of an image that was created in V-Ray just using the default settings and V-Ray Express. So there was almost no setup involved in creating this image, and you can see that although we've had very little setup here, we're able to get a good amount of difference between materials that are nominally similar here but have got different specifics. So we can see a big difference between the aluminium here and the painted silver material here. You can see some nice mottling in the surface of the material here. So all of these things are available to us even when we're only using V-Ray at a very basic level. So let's look at how light is calculated in rendering software in general, and more specifically in V-Ray. So here we've got a rather crude diagram of a light source and a couple of objects. So the light that's coming from the light source is termed as direct illumination. This illumination could be from the sun, it could be from V-Ray rectangular lights, it could be from spotlights, and this is responsible for obviously lighting the objects in question and also creating contact shadows. Now, of course, there's a lot more involved in a rendering than just direct illumination, and there is this concept called indirect illumination, and this is essentially the light that is bouncing around between the objects. So if we look at the diagram here, where we're just essentially tracing one ray of light, one ray probably of millions of rays of light, we have our direct illumination here as our first arrow, and then we have our first bounce of indirect illumination. Now, V-Ray breaks indirect illumination down into two different segments. The first bounce of indirect illumination are called primary bounces, and all the subsequent bounces of light are called secondary bounces. Now, the reason that primary and secondary bounces are split up is so that we can employ different lighting calculations or different rendering calculations for different real-world situations. Now, in order to explain why we might need to do this, let's consider first of all a fairly well-lit studio shot. Here we are looking at the result of direct illumination, which is a light source coming sort of from behind the ball here, and we're also rendering here both primary and secondary bounces of indirect illumination. So you'll see here that although again this is a very simple render, almost no setup involved in this, and it's not intended as being an authoritative or an excellent example of rendering, this is just merely here as an example, you'll see that the indirect illumination here is giving us this nice color bleed and nice soft shadows around the base of the football. Now, in a well-lit studio scene such as this, the secondary bounces of light, if we remove those, you'll see the secondary bounces of light don't contribute significantly to the indirect illumination or global illumination in the scene. So what tends to happen for well-lit scenes is that we use a calculation for the secondary bounces that is a very accurate calculation but only traces a few bounces. And if we remove the indirect illumination altogether, you can see that whilst our rendering now is nowhere near as realistic as it was previously, you can see that most of the actual lighting in this scene, or the majority of it, is actually coming from that indirect illumination. Things are very different when we come to look at an interior scene. Now again, here we have just a very quick basic interior render, and here we're using calculations in V-Ray to create the primary and secondary bounces. We're using a calculation type called irradiance map for the primary bounces, and we're using a calculation type called light cache for the secondary bounces. Okay, now light cache is a specific or a calculation that's unique to V-Ray, and this is a heavily approximated calculation that allows us to calculate a great number of secondary bounces, the default being 100. Now, if we were to look at this scene without the secondary bounces, you can see that on an interior scene where, in this case, nearly all of the light is coming in from outside, we are extremely dependent on these secondary bounces to light the scene. And if we were to use a brute force rendering calculation, as we did with the football, to create the secondary bounces, you'll see that this results in a number of things. We get a loss of quality, a loss of light, and a massive increase in render time. So you can see that in this case the proprietary light cache calculation that V-Ray has not only speeds up the interior rendering but improves the or can improve the quality and also results in an image where we're harvesting much more of that indirect illumination. So unfortunately, because you can choose calculations in terms of 4 different calculations for primary bounces and 3 possible different calculation types for secondary bounces, the perception is that V-Ray can be somewhat complicated. And so the interface of V-Ray is very detailed and very complex and consists of a number of numeric inputs that we need to input into the V-Ray options. To simplify this, V-Ray 2 now has a number of preset categories. So we have presets for interiors, general scenes, exterior scenes, and camera scenes. And if we were to choose one of these, you'll see that we've got options on these as well. So we can already now set up a scene with a number of preset calculations, and we can also, I'm just going to reset this to defaults here, and we can also now use this free plugin called V-Ray Express, which gives us a means of adding some environments, some HDR environments, some studio lights, or some materials. Now, before we look at V-Ray Express in the context of a more detailed model, there's just a couple of simple concepts inside of V-Ray that I think it's worth explaining. So, first of all, if we are going to only look at a couple of tabs or rollouts inside of V-Ray here, probably the 2 most important from the point of a new user being able to understand the software would be the environment section here and the output section here. So the environment section here allows us to control the global illumination that's going on in the scene, the background, and additionally and optionally the reflection and refraction that's going on in the scene. So I'm just going to leave V-Ray for a moment just to explain a little about what the Skylight is. Essentially, the Skylight, and most modern renderers will employ a method similar to this. The Skylight is a notional sphere or hemisphere that surrounds the scene in question. This isn't actually a physical object that you can see, or it's not a geometry object as such, but it's a notional sphere or hemisphere that surrounds the scene, and the idea is that this hemisphere emits a steady ambient light. And you can optionally turn this off in V-Ray. You can use it as a substantial or an insubstantial component in the rendering. But when you're first setting up a render, it's pretty useful to make some use of the Skylight. So let's go back into V-Ray and just look at the interface here in more detail in terms of the Skylight panel. Okay, so first of all here we can turn the Skylight on or off, and then we have a color here where we can control the color of the Skylight. Now, if you're going to use any color in the the Skylight or in any lights in V-Ray, then the color that you use needs to be pretty not very intense. Otherwise, there'll be a massive kind of coloration of the scene. So subtlety is the order of the day when you're using colored illumination. Next to the color slot here, we have a multiplier. Default for this is 1. Higher values, fairly obviously, will lead to brighter illumination. So before we just have a look what a render at default settings looks like, I'm just going to go back to my default settings here. Let's look at the other tab here, which is the output setting. This basically controls the size of my render. So if I want to render out at viewport proportions, let's say my perspective view here, but I actually want to render out slightly bigger than the viewport, then what I can do is to check override viewport, and I can then hit this button here, which is get view aspect, which gives me the length and height of the image, and then I can lock the image aspect here, type in the size that I want, and if I click on here, I'll get the appropriate ratio. So going back to environment now, if we look in this slot here at background, you'll see we have a background that's enabled here. So now I'm just going to do a quick test render here, and you'll see the background enabled here, and you'll see that we have some basic shading here, which is created by the Skylight. No direct illumination here, so we don't get very strong contact shadows. Using just a Skylight render is very often employed by architects or product designers when they are just looking at the form of an object without considering materials. And it's a very quick way of being able to create a sense of a good rendered image where materials don't come into play at all. So if I was to now I'm just going to remove a couple of things here which shouldn't actually be in here once I've returned to defaults, but never mind. If I was to now look at applying some materials to the scene, this is a little more what I was expecting to see before, actually. If I was to look now at applying some materials to the scene, let's take a very quick look at the V-Ray material editor. So what we see here is that by default there are no materials loaded into our scene. V-Ray doesn't as such ship with a material library, but when you install V-Ray Express, then we actually start to see a library here. So I'm going to select these spheres here and go to my materials here. You'll see that I've got a choice of RAL colors, metals, glass, liquid, car paint, porcelain, plastic. Let's look at plastic here. I've also got some architectural materials, some fabrics. So I'm going to just choose a glossy plastic here and apply that to the scene. And let's render this out again now in V-Ray. What we'll see now clearly is that we see the materials being applied here, but we still don't really have anything interesting going on here. So let's look at the idea maybe now of bringing in a background which will help interest in the reflections of our objects. We can do this by going to our environment here, and this is where we introduce the V-Ray texture editor, which is a global means of applying image maps or texture maps anywhere inside of V-Ray. So to add an image into the background, I click on the little M symbol here and I go to text bitmap, and I'm going to load in an HDR image here. Now we'll explain a little bit more about what an HDR image is in the second of the two webinars that we're running, which is in a couple of weeks time. But essentially they are images which contain a little more light information than a normal JPEG image, in fact quite a lot more light information than the normal JPEG image, and are also generally distorted, so that when this image is mapped onto our notional sphere or hemisphere, then we see the reflections reflecting in a manner that suggests that our objects are sitting in a correct environment. And that's why here I changed the mapping type to environment. Okay, so now if I render this time, you'll see that we start to see the reflections appearing inside our scene now, and our objects are starting to become more lifelike. So we've got some soft shadows created by the skylight, and we've got our reflection which is created from the background. Now in a lot of product scenes we want to try and simulate a studio scene, maybe where we have a white or a neutral studio background, and this background here that we see can be a little bit distracting. So one of the interesting things that we can do inside of V-Ray is that we can add a reflection map here, and again I'll use the same map. And we can remove the map from the background, and instead of having a black background here, I can have maybe a white background or a slightly pale grey background here. And so we can create something now where the background is not actually what's reflecting on the objects. Now this way of working is pretty much what most renderers would use as a starting point to create studio scenes. Got a little bit too much reflection on that floor now, so let's just go into the material and change that reflection. So let's go to our materials browser here, and I'll go to my glossy plastic here. And an interesting thing that you can do when you're using a floor material in V-Ray is that we can go to our options here, and I'm going to take that bump map off there. We can go to reflection here, and we can have the material reflect something else other than the background or the global reflection. And here I'm going to use what's called a text A color and just put in a white reflection here and preview the material. And I'm also going to have a look up here. just going to reduce this a little bit here and here. So just reducing the reflection and the glossiness slightly here, and then let's just have another quick render pass of this. So you can see now that our background and our floor almost seamlessly kind of merge into one another, and by slightly reducing the reflectivity of the ground plane, we can, and also making it reflect a white color, we can have the impression of a basic studio scene where the objects are reflecting something interesting and the environment is much more neutral. Now, this is very much an oversimplification, but this is the sort of basis of how most renderers would start to tackle a studio scene. When I say renderers, I don't mean people who render, I mean most rendering software. So, for example, a lot of the sort of more simplified real-time renderers would use this type of metaphor to produce a studio scene. Now, of course, the advantage of V-Ray is that we can go far beyond that. We can start with this as a sort of base point and then build on this and do something much more exciting than this. Now, let's look at a slightly more involved scene here and look a little more detail at V-Ray Express. Now, another element that we haven't really looked at yet is V-Ray RT. So V-Ray comes with two rendering engines. The production renderer, which is what we were looking at previously, and V-Ray RT. Now, in V-Ray 2.0, V-Ray RT is now an in Viewport mode inside of Rhino. So when we have the V-Ray plugin installed, you'll see we've actually got a V-Ray RT mode now. Now, this takes just a second to kick in, and you'll see that this is actually an interactive window here that we can move, just like a Rhino window here, and we can see the render start to complete in front of us. Okay, now the render here is pretty much at default settings, although fairly obviously here we've got some pre-applied materials. But I wanted to take a look really at a couple of things that we can do with V-Ray Express to quickly set up a scene. So V-Ray Express allows us to use some HDR environments. Now, most of these are actually V-Ray dome lights. Now, the dome light is again is fairly new in V-Ray for Rhino, and this is a terrific way of lighting jewelry, product, even automotive, and even to a certain extent some architectural applications. And we're going to explain how the dome light is used in detail in the second of our two webinars. We also have some studio lighting setups here. Now, most of these setups are setups using rectangular lights, more of which in a moment, but rectangular lights, or area lights as they're called in other V-Ray plugins like V-Ray for Macs. Area lights or rectangular lights are a major component of lighting in V-Ray, and we'll just go through some of those basics in a moment. We've got some studio floors here that we can put in, so I'll just put in a disk here, and you'll see as soon as I put this in, this is updated in the V-Ray Express window immediately, and we've got some materials here as well, so I can apply materials to objects here. So, for example, if I was to just go to my main menu here inside my my layers menu inside of Rhino here, and I'm just going to select the top components here, and let's go to my metal materials here. You'll see that there's quite a few of these materials actually already built into Rhino. To apply these materials here, it's much easier than using the materials browser. It's just a case of having the object selected, finding the material that I need, in this case silver paint, clicking on the material, and that material is applied, and you'll see it updates immediately here in the V-Ray RT window. So any changes I make to lighting, materials, etc. are updated immediately here. So just going to select a couple of other bits of geometry here, and let's give these a different material here, like a black metal here. Okay, that looks better, so we can start to see the logo now. And from my materials browser, just so I can show you how one would normally apply a material here. So the normal way of applying a material here in V-Ray is to pick, for example, here the ground plane. Pick on the material in the materials browser. Once we have a materials loaded into our scene, then these materials will preview here. Any changes that I make to the materials will be updated in real time if I have this live update button checked here. So these materials aren't actually crude previews. These are actual rendering of the actual material with all these kind of settings updated here. So as you tweak the material, the preview actually updates on the fly. So very often we're asked, why doesn't V-Ray have this kind of visual material library that's loaded into the material editor by default? And this really is the answer to that, is because here we've got some sort of starting materials. We load these in, and then these previews are live and they get updated as we go along. So we don't really even need to look at the scene to fine-tune the material. We can look at the material previews. So it's actually a pretty efficient way of working. So I'm just going to apply my ground plane material here. So got the ground plane selected. So I right click on the material here and I apply the material to the selection. Okay, and just close the material browser down here, and you'll see now that we now have our reflective ground plane material enabled. So I mentioned a little bit about rectangular lights earlier on, and I didn't load these in yet, did I? So let's do that. It would make more sense if I did that. So let's go to Studio Lighting here, and let's load in my rectangular lights. Okay, so I'm using a preset here, and here's my rectangular lights, which are illuminating the scene. You see the lighting has changed a little bit now, and the idea is with these studio scenes is that we can use these as a starting point for the render. So we don't necessarily need to stick with these. If we want to change to another lighting setup, we can do that. Okay, and what happens with these presets here, with these V-Ray Express here, is that when you input one set of rectangular lights, the last set are removed. This was when V-Ray first started to port for V-Ray. One of the issues was that presets tended to change everything globally. So here, this is a much nicer way of working now, because we can just load in and remove lights as we go. So just because these are preset doesn't mean that these are dumbed down in any way. So we can still kind of get hold of these lights, rotate them and move them just as though we would do with anything else in V-Ray. And you'll see here we're getting some kind of strange artifacts appearing. Now, let's have a look at what those are and how we control those. So first of all, the rectangular lights. If we select one of these rectangular lights and go to Properties and then pick on Light here, you'll see that these rectangular lights here that are enabled in V-Ray Express have an image map applied to them, so they're they have an intensity here, which of course we can increase, and we have some options here, the rectangular lights can be made invisible, and we can also make sure that they don't affect reflections as well. And you'll see that when we pick that light and we uncheck affect reflections, we don't now see that light reflected in our ground plane. Now the rectangular lights, and again we're going to expand on these in the second webinar, but these are probably the most widely used V-Ray light, not only in V-Ray for Rhino, but I would guess in V-Ray in other applications as well. Now at their default settings, which are scalar settings, these lights are particularly easy to configure because they work on the basis of surface area. So at a given multiplier, let's say a multiplier of 1, if you have two lights, both of a multiplier of 1, one light has twice the surface area of the first light, then the light that is twice as big in surface area will be twice as bright. So there is a direct link between the size of the rectangular light and the brightness. And there is also a direct link between the size of the light and the sharpness of the shadows that are created from the light. So the smaller the light, the sharper the shadows that are created from the rectangular light. So it's a fairly easy equation because you know that area is the controller here, so you know basically that if you want to make a light, maybe you want to sharpen up the shadows a little, but keep the intensity the same, then what you could do is reduce the surface area by a quarter and turn up the multiplier by a factor of 4, so multiply it by 4, and you get the same light but with sharper shadows. Also, the rectangular lights now are pretty easy to deal with because we can snap to them, so they're easy to manipulate and point at the object in question. And the other great thing about the rectangular lights is they are fairly subtle as well. So when we, for example, move this light around here, and we increase its brightness here, I'm going from 8 to 20 on the intensity scale here, you'll see that I don't really you know, blow out any of the exposure here, because these lights are pretty subtle, so I've got quite a lot of latitude with these lights in terms of how bright I can make them. Finally, just a couple of other things just to wrap up here. You can see V-Ray Express here working in Viewport. The idea with V-Ray Express is that it is a progressive path ray tracer. So the longer we leave it, the more it refines the rendered image. Now in V-Ray 2.0, if we go to our options, we can either use CPU or we can use GPU to drive the image. So let's switch to GPU here, and we can also use Hdr acceleration here. So here we've got a PNY NVIDIA Quadro 4000 here in this machine. So we've also got quite a lot of processors as well going on in this machine. So we'll probably find that these two are going to be pretty similar to each other. This is actually not quite functioning as it should do at the moment. So if we switch to the conventional renderer, and let's just take a look at this here. Sorry, let me right-click on this to open up the conventional renderer here. And again, it would help if I rendered the right view here. You'll see that we should get pretty much exactly the same view that we're seeing with V-Ray RT. But you will see there will be some subtle differences and some things that the production renderer will always do better than RT. And particularly when we come to look up here at the reflections that are going on in our flash area here, if I want to concentrate on that area, I can use that button here, and I can move the mouse, and the renderer will follow the mouse around. You'll see that because of the way that the production renderer works, we can actually capture much more light going on inside of this flash area here with a production renderer. The other thing that we can do with a production renderer as well is that we can, once the image is started to render, we can do things like turn on exposure correction here, and we can tweak the exposure of the image while the render is in progress. We can use curves. We can put on post-processing effects like bloom and glare. And the reason why you might want to do this inside of the frame buffer image rather than taking this into Photoshop afterwards is that this image here is what's called a floating point color image. So it's an image which has got millions of color levels and much more levels of grayscale than you would see in something like a basic JPEG or TIFF image. So if we make changes to the exposure in an image like the frame buffer image, then we preserve as much light information as possible while we're doing that. So just quickly to come out of V-Ray for a moment and just look very quickly at a couple of other very basic images that we created here using the presets. One of the things we're going to look at maybe in the next webinar is the idea of using emissive materials, so we can make things like screens and buttons that actually illuminate and make those look really realistic. And we can also use depth of field as well inside of V-Ray. Depth of field now is really pretty fast inside of V-Ray, and that's another thing that we'll look at in the next webinar session in a couple of weeks. So pretty much that was really what I intended to go through. So I hope that's been of use for all of you watching, and I'll hand you back over to Steph.
Great. Hello. Hi. Thanks, Phil.
Hi.
So we'll move on now to our Q&A session. We've had some questions come through, and for this I'd like to introduce Paul from Simply Rhino, who along with Phil will answer the questions. So over to you please, Paul.
Okay, thanks Steph. Phil, there's a few questions here.
Okay.
First one from Luke was, when you're rendering those spheres, can you use a HDRI as a material for the spheres themselves in the same way as it was used for the background?
As a material, yes, you can. Yes, and you can also use an HDRI to light with as well. The method of using an HDR to light with, in terms of using that in the environment tab in the Skylight, has really been superseded by the dome light. But yes, you can use HDR images in anything that requires a texture inside of V-Ray.
Right. Okay. Next question from Luke again. Metal materials, he's noticed that they are taking much longer to render than any other type of material. Is that something you notice? And is there anything that can be done to render?
Okay. Well, essentially, I think, Luke, that what you're going to be seeing is that materials that are metals that are blurry metals, so really finishes like we're looking at in front of us here. So any metal material that is not fully polished, or any material really that is not fully polished, generally takes longer to render than a fully reflective material, basically because the calculations are more computationally intensive. So if you imagine you've got a material like a matte chrome, then as the light hits that matte chrome, it bounces off in lots of different directions and diffuses in lots of different directions, where if it was a polished chrome, then the calculation's fairly straightforward. The light bounces, hits it, bounces off, and it's a fairly straightforward calculation. So yes, you will find that materials such as blurry metals will generally take longer to render, and indeed you could see that with our V-Ray Express, that when we put that silver painted top on the camera, it was taking slightly longer to render. Now, ways you can mitigate against this are to maybe try using the Ward shader for metals. You could try substituting the metal materials for simpler materials at preview time, and then just replacing the real materials at for the final render, and then you can actually go deep into the materials, and there are settings inside of those where we can speed up calculations. And we are looking at materials, I believe, in a third of our webinars, and we'll try and look at some ways that we can speed up metals as part of that process.
Great, thanks, Phil. Question about V-Ray Express was asked. A question from Rob about where to download it from. I think it's just from the same customer login area on the Chaos Group website where everyone downloads the installers. I'm sure V-Ray Express is there. Can you
Yeah.
confirm that, Phil? Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
It is there. Okay. Second question is related to that. Did the version of V-Ray Express that you were showing there, was it customized at all, or is that exactly as anyone would see it when they first download and install it?
I'm pretty sure that's the downloaded one, but you can customize it, and it is extensible. So you can add your own materials and your own light setups into there.